Ladies and gentlemen, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora, Neale, Hurston. Last week I made a video on Passing by Nella Larsen. This book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is also a book from the Harlem Renaissance. There she is. Zora Neale Hurston was born in Nottasulga, Alabama in 1891. She is the author of 7 books, 4 novels, 2 books of folklore, and an autobiography, as well as some 50 shorter works. My goodness. She died in 1960. Their Eyes Were Watching God, an American classic, is a luminous and haunting novel about Janie Crawford, a Southern black woman in the 1930s whose journey from a free-spirited girl to a woman of independence and substance has inspired writers. Yes. By the way, this is Grant Loves Books. Please, would you like and subscribe the video? I would appreciate that very much. Please like and subscribe. It helps me very, very, very much. So if you could do that, you know, click. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I had to read this book for university, and I enjoyed it. It's an interesting novel because, well, let me tell you about the plot, okay? So Janie's mother is absent, and Janie is being brought up by her grandmother, who was a slave, and she was later freed. So Janie, she's young, and she's a bit of an idealist. You know, she wants her life to be beautiful and happy. It's funny that you would call someone like that an idealist, isn't it? And one day, grandmother sees Janie. She's a-kissing one of the local boys over the fence. So her grandmother calls her in and says, "That's not the kind of life I had planned for you, Janie. I know you're just but 15 years old, but I think it's time for you to get married to, what's his name? Something Killix. Say George Killix, who's much older. Like, he's perhaps in his 40s. And the grandmother says, "Look, Janie, I know you're not going to be crazy about this idea, but it's just the best thing for you, all right? George Killix, he's mild-mannered. He'll take care of you. You'll have a good life if that man's your husband." And Janie's like, "Well, I don't want to marry that old man. Please, Grandma, don't send me to get married to an old man." But the grandmother insists, and Janie does. She gets married to old George Killix. But she doesn't like it. She finds the life to be monotonous, and she finds George to be a bit of a taskmaster. He allows her to do the easy jobs in the kitchen, but eventually he gets a bit fed up with her uppity ways. You know, he starts insisting that she cut the firewood and that he's going to go buy a mule so that Janie can start helping him with the plowing. And she really does not want to be doing this heavy physical manual labor. Some handsome devil appears out of nowhere, says, "Hey, girlie, why don't you come with me? I am someone with aspirations, and it hurts me to see you living out here in this nowhere land, married to some ruthless old fool. Come with me and we're going to make something of ourselves." Janie abandons her first husband, runs off with this man. So she gets married to this new man, Jody. And Jody really is industrious. They drive or they take the train down to Florida. They get married, and Jody goes to this, it's not even a town, it's just like a little bunch of houses along the main road. And Jody becomes the mayor of this town, and he builds it up. First, he builds the shop. With the power of his own 2 hands, he makes this nowhere land into a really proper, not exactly city, but very nearly. And it is extremely inspiring. However, Janie's not too happy with her position in his busy world. That he built the shop, he owns the shop, and he expects her to work in the shop 6 days a week. And the shop becomes a bit of a central fixture of this small town, and everybody's sitting on the porch watching everybody go by. And all the old fellas, they play checkers, and they make comments about everyone, as people do. Janie doesn't like it. She doesn't like working in the shop, and she severely doesn't like it that when she wants to participate in some of these conversations that are going on the porch with all of the local people, her husband tells her to shut up and get back in the shop, and that we don't want to hear any women's comments. So that is quite a repressive man that she's living under. But she sticks with him. She stays with that husband for, I think, 17 years, and he dies just of, overwork. And hardworking man, he just worked himself into the grave. So Janie is in mourning, and along comes Tea Cake, who becomes husband number 3. And Tea Cake is younger than Janie, and he's a bit wild. He makes his money how he can. He tells her that he's a professional gambler. He could beat anybody, anytime with a deck of cards. He's a bit of a troubadour. He plays music and passes the hat for money. He wants to move them down to the Everglades because then, you know, they're going to have the fruit picking season. He's going to pick all the fruit, going to make a huge pile of money that way. He's going to teach Janie how to pick, and they're going to be picking together, and they're going to make all kinds of money. And Tea Cake is a lot of fun, and Janie just can't help be enamored with him, especially after her 2 previous husbands. Like, here's a man who wants to show her some fun, which is what she's been missing her entire life. He takes her fishing. So she meets husband number 3, who's very lively. And that's what the book is all about, is how this woman eventually finds love and happiness. So I had a bit of a theory about the 3 husbands. I don't know too much about American slavery. If what I'm about to say sounds completely stupid and childish, please forgive me, because in this subject area, I'm really quite uneducated. That's not going to prevent me from saying it, though. So I found husband number 1, George Killix, to be a representation of slavery. You cannot leave the farm, and this man is the master, and he has the whip, and you must obey him. And she runs off from this husband. Now, husband number 2 is after slavery was abolished and they had these Jim Crow laws. One of the things was that became quite common in the South was this sharecropping. And as I understand it, sharecropping was very much like slavery without all of the whipping and the murdering. The slaves were freed, but they did not have any education. Most of them could not read or write. Very doubtful any of them had any clothes. Even though they were emancipated, it didn't mean that they could really go anywhere or get a better job. A lot of these freed slaves ended up working for the same people, doing the same job, and being paid almost nothing because the owner of the farm, the sharecroppers, could pay their workers whatever they liked because they knew these people didn't have the opportunity to really go anywhere. They paid them very poorly. And I see that as being representative of Janie's second husband, that there is freedom. You know, now she doesn't have to stay in the kitchen and cut wood or plow with a mule. She's allowed to work in the shop, but her husband keeps a very strong eye on her. And she does have freedom, but if she wants to exercise her freedom a little bit more by making comments, like when everybody's laughing and joking, she wants to say something funny, but he won't let her. I found that second husband to be sort of the, you know, this Jim Crow sharecropping state of slavery. And the third husband, Tea Cake, I found him to be like representative of today's free market capitalism as it is enjoyed in America, where it's important to make money any way you can. And the legality of how you make your money is not as important to us as making it. I know that's not quite accurate in America, but that attitude, money by all means. How did you get it? Let's not speak about it. Let's just admire all the things I bought with it. Similar in a way to Gatsby. They love him because he's rich and nobody knows where his money came from, and it doesn't matter because he has the best parties. I know that's not an accurate representation of America today, but all of these Bitcoin scandals and YouTube influencers getting rich off of, you know, shenanigans, it seems that sort of get rich by any means necessary attitude is still really heavily prevalent in America. Anyway, so that's how I felt about Janie's third husband, that he was this kind of a wild, freewheeling character, that he did make a huge amount of money, but then he was also sliced a couple of times from some people who were not happy that he'd won so much out of their poker game. There's an American attitude in that. We might die, but we might get rich while we're doing it. So that was my little theory about representation of Janie's three husbands. Maybe it doesn't stand up to too careful examination, but I like it. I thought that was kind of a fun idea to play with. Zora Neale Hurston had a bit of a hard time because I don't know if you're very familiar with the Harlem Renaissance. One of the major players in the Harlem Renaissance was a poet by the name of Langston Hughes. He wrote a famous poem called What Happens to a Dream Deferred. This poem is about the aspiration of Black Americans to have as good a life as white people do. America, this land of equality. Why are Black people living second-class citizen life in this supposed land of opportunity and freedom? Langston Hughes was one of the real pioneers and police chiefs of the Harlem Renaissance because he had some very definite views about Black writing, that Black writing had to be pushing the Black agenda and not catering to the white audience, that Black writing needed to represent Black Americans. If you're thinking about, say, like Richard Wright, he wrote this book called Black Boy, and Black Boy, you could feel the racism dripping off every page in Black Boy. Like, Black Boy is a hard book to read. It's a memoir. It's an autobiography from Richard Wright. It's a brilliant book and really excellent, but violent. And Langston Hughes approved of that, that was what Black writing should be. And he did not approve of Zora Neale Hurston's book. He actually said some very defamatory, is that a word? He didn't like it. He really said a lot of very unpleasant things about this book, that it didn't represent the Black American literature that he wanted people to be reading, which is really quite a shame. This self-appointed guardian of Black writing in America in the 1930s, like, he really felt that to be a Black American writer, you were Black first, and you were only a writer if your writing pushed the ideology of what it meant to be a Black person in America. I guess that was fine for the writers he liked, but for Zora Neale Hurston, whose book he didn't like, well, maybe she got a bit of an unfair disadvantage because of that. While I was reading this book, I didn't feel it was a lot about Black liberation. For me, this book was more about female empowerment. You know, she's not a slave, but she's born into this family. She doesn't have a mother or father. She lives with her grandmother, who's very strict and very narrow-minded because she was a slave. Her grandmother kind of sells her off to this older man because he's going to take care of her, a little bit like slave trading there. This main character, Janie, goes through all of these stages in her life to become a happy middle-aged woman who doesn't need to explain herself to anyone. She doesn't need to make excuses. She doesn't need to tell lies. She doesn't even need to answer any questions. And I think that's quite a good book. This book is written in a southern dialect of English, which might be a bit tricky if you're not familiar with reading books that are written in dialect, how the characters would be speaking the lines. I didn't find it difficult at all. Like, sometimes I had to pause and sort of sound out these words, and once I got the sound and I realized okay, all right, then suddenly it all makes sense. But I think it was kind of fun to read a book that was written in dialect almost completely. So yes, so going along with Passing by Nella Larsen last week, I would also recommend Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. If you are thinking about reading some books for Black History Month, this is quite a good one. A little bit more on the female empowerment rather than on the Black emancipation, but still, very much a Black American novel. And short, 230 pages, not long. Quite a surprise for me, because I know that one's been on the list for a really long time, and I've always seen it. Maybe I was never really too crazy about the title, but I'm very happy to have read this one, and I hope you will give it a try. You just want to understand more about the craziness that went on in America in the 20th century, because, it was wild. It's still wild today. Thank you very much for watching. This is Grant. This is Grant Loves Books. I am Grant, and this is Grant Loves Books. If you would please like and subscribe, that would be great. All right, thanks very much for watching. Have a great day.